welcome. So happy to have you. I'm Lara Smith. I'm the director of the African Studies program, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. We're really happy and excited for this timely talk on South Africa's solidarity with Palestine, and we're honored to have William Shoki, editor-in-chief of the highly regarded online magazine Africa's a Country, with us today. But I want to start by welcoming you all here, both those in person and those online. I find it really invigorating to see so many of us that want to talk of solidarity, which brings us together today. I'd like to thank first all the sponsors who've helped us come together and to bring this important speaker and friend, Will Shoki, to us today. That includes ourselves, the African Studies program. We're very honored to be part of this. The Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, Department of English, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and Georgetown University, Qatar. Today, our speaker, Will Shoki, will help us frame South Africa's position globally, but particularly with respect to Palestine, as it's been shaped by domestic contestation, post-apartheid memory, and global realignments, and consider what kind of internationalism is being modeled today in the name of Palestine. A bit about Will Shoki. Although much more could be said. Delighted to meet him in person after so many years of reading him, as I know many of you probably have as well. He's a South African writer and editor based in Cape Town. He's the editor-in-chief of Africa is a Country, a publication of global political commentary rooted in African perspectives. He's written for the New York Times, Al Jazeera, the Jacobin, Art Review, the Mail and Guardian, and many other outlets as well. So welcome to Will, and thank you so much for coming so far to be with us today in person. It means a lot.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Lara. Despite the far distance traveled, the hospitality and warmth that I've experienced here at Georgetown has distance feel not so far, and in Washington generally. So thank you to you, to the African Studies program, to the Al Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, for the Center of Contemporary African Studies, all the other co-sponsors, and Georgetown University for having me here. It feels as a tremendous honor and privilege. So I'm here to talk about South Africa's solidarity with Palestine, which is something I'm sure all of you have been paying attention to over the last 2 years. And something interesting happened recently in South Africa. In mid-November, reports began circulating in Johannesburg that a plane full of Palestinians had landed at OR Tambo International Airport, and no one knew where it had come from or why. Photographs soon showed the passengers sitting on the tarmac inside a grounded aircraft, some holding toddlers, some barefoot, all visibly exhausted after 12 hours without food or water. The 153 passengers were Palestinians from Gaza. They had not come through Rafah or Egypt, nor through any recognized humanitarian channel. They had been moved through Kerem Shalom under Israeli military escort and flown out of Ramon Airport, the desert facility used to quietly funnel select Palestinians out of Gaza, on tickets brokered by an organization calling itself Al-Majd Humanitarian. Al-Majd claimed offices in Germany and Sheikh Jarrah. None existed. The website was new. The phone numbers dead. The operator, an Israeli-Estonian entrepreneur, coordinating evacuations over WhatsApp, for which families paid anything between $1,500 and $2,700 US. Behind this sat a new office in Israel's Defense Ministry, the Voluntary Immigration Bureau, created to loosen restrictions on Palestinians leaving Gaza. The Israeli magazine and newspaper Haaretz later confirmed that Al-Majd had been referred directly to the IDF. What looked like a private rescue operation, at minimum state-enabled and quite possibly state-directed. When the aircraft landed in Johannesburg, South African officials were blindsided. The passengers had no stamped passports, no return tickets, and no documentation of where they had been before boarding in Nairobi. After half a day on the tarmac, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa intervened. "We cannot turn them back," he said. These are people of a war-torn land. Then he added something quieter, more unsettling. It does seem like they were being flushed out. That phrase, flushed out, is what brings us here. It names the forces at work in Gaza, in international diplomacy, and now unexpectedly in South Africa. Engineered displacement, the weaponization of humanitarian language, the emergence of shadowy infrastructures of removal, and the quiet ways states collaborate in managing or manufacturing the movement of unwanted populations. It captures the diplomatic truth that diplomatic euphemisms like safe passages and evacuation corridors obscure, that the line between evacuation and expulsion has thinned, and that South Africa, by accident or design, now finds itself inside that architecture. I begin with this episode because it condenses in a single story the themes that run through this lecture: the violence of engineered movement, the frailty of international law, the contested meanings of solidarity, and the shifting role of the global South as both a sanctuary and a moral insurgent in a collapsing world order. And so the question that will guide roughly the next hour is this: what kind of internationalism is being forged when a country like South Africa, fragile, unequal, and post-apartheid, becomes both a prosecutor of genocide at The Hague and a quiet, receiving ground for Palestinians being flushed out of Gaza? South Africa's present stance on Palestine cannot be understood without returning to the long arc of the anti-apartheid struggle itself. The international campaign against apartheid creates not only a diplomatic precedent, but also a political imagination. The belief that people under siege can reorganize the moral geography of the world. Long before 1994, the ANC had helped build a vast transnational network. Students, unions, churches, liberation movements, sympathetic governments, UN structures, who collectively treated racial domination in South Africa as a global problem demanding global action. That history established a template for thinking about oppression as something that exceeds borders and generates obligations beyond formal alliances and national interest. The relationship between the ANC and the Palestine Liberation Organization developed in that same spirit. It was never only an analogy, as often invoked today, but both movements understood themselves as confronting settler colonial domination. It was forged also through shared structures of experience: exile, camps, armed struggle, the refusal of cooptation, and the constant need to defend one's humanity against narratives that cast the colonized as security threats. When Nelson Mandela declared in 1997, as famously known, that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians, he was not producing a metaphor, but speaking from inside a political genealogy that treated liberation not as simply as a national achievement, but as a planetary horizon. After 1994, this tradition of transnational commitment became woven into the very fabric of the fledgling state. Post-apartheid foreign policy was animated by what second Democratic President Thabo Mbeki called an African Renaissance, but it also carried the residual voltage of global anti-apartheid solidarity. South Africa entered the international system not as a blank slate, but as a moral project, a country trying to convert the memory of its own oppression into the language of universal rights. The new government became a champion of multilateralism, not out of obstruction, but because it understood how decisive multilateral structures had been on its own struggle. Its participation in peacekeeping missions, its mediation roles in regional conflicts, and its early leadership on issues like landmine bans or nuclear non-proliferation were all built on this conviction that small states can exercise normative power, even over greater powers, when they speak from a history of moral struggle. But this account must be complicated somewhat. South Africa's foreign policy had never really been consistently principled. The refusal to condemn Nigeria, for example, after the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the military intervention in Lesotho in 1998, or later equivocations on Zimbabwe, all show the ways in which the moral authority of the liberation tradition could be selectively deployed or strategically muted. The post-apartheid state inherited a powerful ethical vocabulary, but also had to survive in a world structured by hard power. Its moral commitments were always in tension with geopolitical pressures, domestic crises, and institutional limits. The tension between aspiration on the one hand and reality on the other has defined South Africa's diplomatic identity from the very beginning. What remains crucial, however, is that the memory of anti-apartheid solidarity and the belief that internationalism is a political duty never entirely disappeared. It resurfaced in civil society mobilizations around the Iraq War and anti-racism, in activism against the Israeli operations during the 2000s, and later nationwide protests after caste-led and protective edge. For many South Africans, Palestine was not an abstract foreign conflict, but a site where the unfinished work of global decolonization was being replayed in real time. The language of Bantustans, past laws, ethnic fragmentation, and fortified borders resonated with painful familiarity. This resonance wasn't always analytically clean, but it was politically powerful. It created a moral kinship that became embedded in churches, unions, student movements, and NGOs in the country. By the time the Gaza genocide of 2023 and 2024, and indeed ongoing slowly, this infrastructure of solidarity had already been built. What changed was the scale of the violence and the collapse of the diplomatic fictions that had long sustained the peace process. Israel's assault on Gaza triggered memories in South Africa not only of apartheid's brutality, but of something more specific. The ways in which states use law to legitimize dispossession, the ways in which humanitarian language can mask coercive power, and the ways in which moral clarity is often demanded from the oppressed, while impunity is granted to those at the top. Why South Africa's ICJ filing cannot be understood as a sudden diplomatic pivot or a symbolic gesture aimed at domestic constituencies. It is the continuation of a century-long political through line. The belief that liberation obliges one to stand with others still struggling for their freedom, that the meaning of South Africa's own freedom is diminished if it is disconnected from the freedoms of others, and that the role of the post-apartheid state is not simply to commemorate justice, but to enact it even when doing so is costly. Now, to a lot of observers, the ICJ case appeared as a surprising assertion of moral authority by a state grappling with its own crises at home. But for South Africans themselves, particularly for those shaped by the constitutional and activist struggles of the democratic era, the move was entirely legible. It drew from a distinctly South African habit of treating the law not simply as a realm reserved for elites, but as a terrain in which ordinary people have repeatedly confronted power. One of the paradoxes of the post-apartheid settlement is that the Constitution, often celebrated abroad as a technocratic achievement, was itself forged through intense popular struggle. It was a product of a political culture in which communities petitioned, litigated, marched, and argued their way into the national imagination. The great social rights cases that defined the immediate post-apartheid period in South Africa, whether on issues such as the state's duty to ensure access to adequate housing, on the rights to life-saving HIV treatment, were not expressions of middle-class litigiousness, as court cases are often understood internationally. They were, in fact, acts of insurgent interpretation, attempts by the poor and the working class to force the state to reckon with the fact that freedom must have substance, not merely form. This is the legal tradition that produced the lawyers who stood at The Hague. Adela Hassim, for example, who opened South Africa's argument with devastating clarity, built her career litigating the right to health and the right to life, including working on a major silicosis class action against the gold mining industry, which secured compensation for thousands of miners suffering from lung disease. The firm that led that silicosis litigation is where my dear friend Johan Lorenzen, who's in the audience, works. No, Johan flew all the way from Minneapolis just to see me, so I'm very grateful to have him here. And it's through Johan's work and the work of other lawyers in South Africa defending indigenous communities against extractive capital that I first encountered another lawyer who worked in the ICJ case, Tembeka Ngugaitobi. Ngugaitobi, for his part, came to prominence through land restitution and labor tenant cases where rural Black families sought to reclaim land taken under apartheid, and later worked on high-profile constitutional matters, such as forcing transparency around corruption networks in South Africa. And overseeing the case from the bench in the ICJ was Justice Dechang Moseneke, who was appointed as South Africa's ad hoc judge at the ICJ, whose jurisprudence is inseparable from his own journey. He was jailed on Robben Island at 15 for anti-apartheid activism, was later made Deputy Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, and was one of the architects of democratic constitutionalism in South Africa. Seen from this angle, the ICJ case is less an expression of foreign policy than an export of South Africa's post-apartheid political grammar. It is the internationalization of a practice honed in at home, using the law to name the systemic. In domestic courts, South African activists repeatedly insisted that violations of dignity, equality, or housing rights were not aberrations, but symptoms of deeper patterns. At The Hague, the same argumentative structure was made about Gaza. That genocide is not only a matter of intent, but of conditions created and sustained. That the destruction of life occurs not only through bombs, but through sealing borders, withholding medicine, flattening infrastructure, and manufacturing unlivable environments. Rather than focusing narrowly on the conduct on the battlefield, South Africa offered a structural reading of the violence that was being committed in Gaza. There is another aspect of this case that deserves attention, and it's the refusal to accept the shrinking of legal imagination that has characterized the global order over the last 2 decades. The era of the rules-based international system has been one in which the rules themselves were rewritten to accommodate impunity, where powerful states exempted themselves from the very standards they invoked to discipline others. South Africa's filing did not naively believe that the law is neutral, but it did insist that the law can still be a site of contestation, that the tools of the powerful can be repurposed by those whom the system was never designed to protect. For this reason, the case unsettled not only Israel, but the states that have long acted as custodians of international legitimacy. What the case exposes not only the violence in Gaza, but the fragility of the world order that cannot tolerate being judged by those on the margins. It was an inversion of the usual moral geography. A small state, itself the product of anti-apartheid struggle, claiming the authority to interpret the meaning of mass atrocity, and doing so against the preferences of great powers. But it is also important to recognize the limits of this insurgent moment. Litigation is not liberation. Courtrooms, even the most august ones, cannot do the work of political transformation. It was in fact this realization that pushed me away from a career of law where I once interned for Johan. I decided to abandon that in pursuit of journalism, much to the disappointment of my parents and Johan. And what I'm realizing now, it's not as if political writing avoids the same dilemmas that legal work throws up as well. But what both journalism and political writing and courts can do is at best create openings, interpretive shifts, cracks in the facade of invisibility, moments where the legitimacy of power becomes contestable. In South Africa's own history, legal victories were only meaningful when anchored in the social forces capable of sustaining them. The same was true on the international stage. The ICJ case matters not because it will end the siege on Gaza on its own, but because it reactivates the idea that the global order is not fixed, that its doctrines and hierarchies can still be challenged, and that the law, however compromised, can still be a weapon in the hands of the oppressed. But this case simply did not provoke disagreement. It provoked a more revealing response, an effort to delegitimize the messenger rather than engage the message. Within hours of the case being filed, the United States and European Union officials dismissed it as baseless, absurd, or obscene, language notably harsher than their reactions to the mass deaths unfolding in Gaza. Israel's foreign minister accused South Africa of serving as Hamas's legal arm. British commentators described the country as a rogue state. Many commentators, with speed and ferocity, reacted with such hostility to this case. And what that revealed was the anxiety produced when a post-colonial state asserts the authority to interpret the meaning of atrocity. The backlash within South Africa itself followed the same script. Liberal think tanks, business elites, and some commentators tied to Western institutions warned that Pretoria had been captured by Iran or was acting at Moscow's instruction. What these arguments shared was a kind of assumption that South Africa lacked the standing to speak, that a country facing its own problems at home should not lecture the world on human rights, that domestic weakness was not just a political challenge, but grounds for complete disqualification. But the most revealing backlash came from this place, the United States, where the reaction cannot be understood without acknowledging the long afterlife of settler ideology. Since the end of apartheid, a particular strand of white South African politics, most visible among sections of Afrikaners, has cultivated a story of victimhood. That majority rule has placed them under existential threat, that land reform is a prelude to persecution, that South Africa's democratic government prevents them from participating in the economy, and that this all shows the dangers of decolonization. For years, this narrative traveled abroad through farm lobby tours, Christian conservative networks, and diaspora advocacy, quiet efforts to frame Afrikaners as a beleaguered remnant of Western civilization. In the 2010s, it found a near perfect ideological home in the American right. The MAGA worldview and Afrikaner grievance politics share a common language: fear of demographic transformation, the belief that equality is dispossession, the conviction that any redistribution of power is inherently an attack. I should be careful if they are, just making sure. In this fusion of anxieties, South Africa becomes less an ordinary country in the international system and more a metaphor, a warning about what happens when the hierarchy underpinning settler societies collapses. This is the backdrop against which the Trump White House announced a program to resettle Afrikaner refugees, describing them as racially disfavored landowners fleeing violence. It was not responding to any material refugee crisis. It was responding to an ideological one. When South Africa accused Israel of genocide, it violated a core expectation embedded in this worldview: that post-colonial states, especially Black majority states, should not presume to judge the actions of states considered civilizational allies of the West. South Africa's assertion of moral agency was interpreted not as a legal argument, but as an act of defiance. The response being, how could you? Who do you think you are? The subsequent expulsion of South Africa's ambassador made this logic explicit. The White House statement did not focus solely on Gaza. It indicted South Africa for its anti-Western positions, hateful rhetoric, and hostility to equal opportunity. Phrases lifted almost directly from decades of Afrikaner victimhood discourse. In other words, South Africa was not being punished for its legal reasoning. It was being disciplined for violating a racialized hierarchy of international legitimacy. This is why the fallout with the United States feels so charged. South Africa's ICJ case not simply challenged a powerful ally of Washington, it challenged the ideological architecture that casts the West as the arbiter of universalism and the global South as its subject. It forced into view the racial ordering that still structures global moral authority, and it demonstrated how easily a legal intervention by a post-colonial state can be read through the lens of settler nostalgia and mythologies of white victimhood. What the backlash ultimately reveals is that this dispute is not just about Gaza. It is about who is permitted to speak the language of humanity. It is about whether a Black majority country, Black people, brown people in general, can claim moral authority without being treated as insolent. It is about whether the global order, still shaped by the afterlives of colonial domination, can tolerate truth spoken by those who it sees as being meant to never speak at all. So it's no wonder that South Africa's stance has been described as brave, as reckless. For a small, economically fragile state, choosing strategic autonomy in an age of sharpening great power rivalry is indeed a high-risk calculation. The post-Cold War fantasy of a neutral, rules-based order has collapsed. The space for independent diplomacy has shrunk. And since 1994, South Africa's foreign policy has been anchored in non-alignment, not simply as nostalgia for the ages of Bandung, but as a practical response to vulnerability. It allowed Pretoria to, on the one hand, oppose the Iraq War, criticize US policy in Africa, and deepen ties with China without becoming anyone's client. That architecture has somewhat weakened today. The US-China rivalry has hardened, Europe's foreign policy has become more securitized, and the global South's margin of maneuver has narrowed. In this context, the ICJ case is not only principled, it is outright perilous. Many people, including myself, were surprised when it happened. South Africa was poorly insulated from the fallout. A decade of state capture, which is patronage at the highest level of state organs, has hollowed out its diplomatic machinery. The Foreign Affairs Ministry has been hit by budget cuts and politicized appointments. Missions abroad are often overstretched. Regional influence is eroded by domestic crises and the rise of other African powers. The state can still articulate compelling moral arguments, but it struggles to sustain the bureaucratic and strategic work required to turn them into influence. This fragility also helps explain its contradictions. South Africa's solidarity with Palestine is genuine. That goes without question. But it is not matched by consistent engagement in its own region. In Sudan, as the RSF's campaign of mass killing and the siege of Al-Fasher was described as ethnic cleansing and genocide, Pretoria issued only generic appeals to dialogue. There were no emergency diplomacy, no mobilizations in the EU, in the AU, no invocation of the responsibility to protect, as South Africa had once long invoked. The DRC exposes the tension even more sharply. South Africa played a pivotal role in earlier peace processes, such as in the late 90s, but today its position is entangled with mining interests and political rivalries. The deaths of 13 South African soldiers outside Goma in early 2025 highlighted an overstretched, poorly equipped military presence lacking clear objectives. When Pretoria blamed Rwanda, Kigali countered by hinting at ANC involvement in opaque mining deals. The result is an uncomfortable truth. South Africa's regional diplomacy is weak not only by state fragility, but by the perception that its moral authority is compromised. These contradictions even extend into the terrain of Palestinian solidarity itself. South Africa's rhetoric at The Hague has been unequivocal, yet its economic relationships with Israel have not been severed. The country, as you might not believe, still exports coal to Israeli power stations. Its ports continue to handle goods from Israeli-linked shipping companies, and no comprehensive state-led boycott exists beyond statements of principle. In other words, the moral clarity of South Africa's legal intervention has not yet translated into a full reorientation of state practice. The gap between posture and policy is not unique to South Africa, but acknowledging it helps us see the limits of what states acting alone are structurally able to do. These examples do not negate the ICJ case, and that's the important thing to say, no matter what Bill Maher might say about genocide in Sudan or Nigeria. What they do is it clarifies its conditions. South Africa is capable of extraordinary moral clarity abroad and painful ambiguity at home. It is a state with a liberation inheritance and profound institutional weaknesses, one that can articulate a universalist horizon on the one hand, but struggles to enact it consistently on the other. If anything, these contradictions sharpen the stakes of the ICJ moment. They show that the challenge is not simply to withstand backlash from great powers, but to confront internal limits, to move from episodic moral intervention to sustained moral leadership, grounded not only in memory, but in capacity, not only in principle, but in power as well. And they force a further question: whether any state, in reality on its own, can build the internationalism required for the world that we now inhabit. As a post-Cold War order disintegrates, it becomes clearer that moral clarity at the state level is not enough. What is needed is a renewal of political imagination, a horizon that cannot emerge from governments alone. As Johan was telling me this morning, this is not only a South African dilemma. Even the United States, political figures forged in the anti-apartheid moment, including Barack Obama and Keith Ellison, who Johan once worked for, have struggled to extend that legacy to Palestine. Ellison, once a forceful advocate for global justice, has recently opposed even modest divestment measures targeting companies complicit in Gaza's destruction, a contradiction that Johan publicly is challenging in Minnesota, and paused that to come see me here today. The point here is not simply to single out individuals, but to recognize something structural. I'm a Marxist, by the way, if that isn't clear at this point. States narrow the horizon, but movements widen it. And without movements capable of sustaining and expanding that horizon, even those formed in earlier struggles can themselves be unable to recognize a new iteration of an old injustice. So how do we forge that horizon? How do we expand it? If there is one thing that the ICJ moment revealed, it is that the term the Global South is too small to contain and to interpret what is happening. The Global South has always been an uneven geography. Census category, a geopolitical placeholder, a budget line in the World Bank's annual reports. It describes an arrangement of power, but not its aspiration. But the energy that is gathered around Palestine, from Bogota to Dakar to Kuala Lumpur to Johannesburg, belongs to something wider and more unruly. This is what Mansour bin Musallam calls the Greater South, not a block of states, but a field of dissident consciousness. It names a shared political frustration with a world order that has exhausted its moral claims, and the refusal by peoples and at times by governments to accept the shrinking horizons bequeathed by the neoliberal end of history. It accounts for the return of mass mobilization in places long rendered peripheral by geopolitics and ignored by Western attention, and it helps explain why the language of solidarity today sounds less like Bandung and more like the energy of the streets of Nairobi, Maputo, Kathmandu, and Antananarivo. What unites the Greater South as a field of contention is not policy coherence necessarily, but a shared understanding of being governed by an order that no longer pretends to be just. It is shaped by debt and austerity, by digital repression and extractive economies, by authoritarian drift and collapsing social provision. It is shaped by a world in which the powerful now openly reserve the rights to kill with impunity, and in which humanitarianism has been converted into managerial technology for administering crises rather than ending it. South Africa has, on occasion, been a central voice in contesting this order. The ICJ case is but one pivotal example of that. But it also brings into sharp relief another difficult truth: that South Africa's moral boldness abroad sits uneasily alongside its political exhaustion at home. The state that can name genocide with clarity cannot provide consistent electricity to its own people. It can argue for universal rights in The Hague while presiding over an economy structured by mass unemployment and deepening inequality. It can condemn ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza while failing to mobilize anything close to the same urgency for Sudan or the DRC or Mozambique next door. This disjuncture is not accidental. It reflects a broader collapse of an emancipatory horizon and imagination inside South Africa's own politics. Just months after standing before the ICJ, the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, suffered its worst electoral defeat since 1994, losing its parliamentary majority and revealing the depth of public disillusionment. For the first time in South Africa's democratic era, it was forced into a so-called government of national unity, a broad, uneasy coalition with former opposition parties, including the center-right Democratic Alliance, which is widely seen as catering to white middle-class South Africans, which now anchors the state to a politics of fiscal restraint and market-friendly governance. The GNU was marketed to South Africans as a form of stabilization, but in practice, it had entrenched an austerity consensus and diluted whatever transformative ambition of the ANC that it once claimed to hold. This erosion had begun long before the election. A decade of state capture and corruption hollowed out institutions. The ANC drifted from being a liberation movement animated by egalitarian ideals to an organization, as some people put it, disciplined by the market, where economic policy is determined less by considerations of justice than by trying to reassure investor confidence. The left in South Africa, structurally, intellectually, organizationally, has largely disintegrated. The once powerful unions, its federations, and the South African Communist Party are hollowed out, and populist formations that have splintered from the ANC mobilize resentment without offering a coherent emancipatory alternative. The result is this contradiction of a state capable of extraordinary moral clarity while governing domestically as though its horizon of possibility has already closed. And yet, the politics emerging in the Greater South reminds us that politics does not begin and end with the state. The resurgence of transnational movements have begun to articulate a horizon that neither Washington, nor Beijing, nor Pretoria can contain. In that sense, South Africa's contradictions are emblematic of a broader international crisis, the widening gap between what people demand and what states are able or willing to imagine. This is why the ICJ case feels less like an endpoint and more like an opening. The intervention resonated not because the state is strong in South Africa, but because the world is hungry for a language of justice that does not come from empire. The Greater South names a constituency that is trying to keep that hunger alive. It is not a bloc, it is not an institution, it is a moral geography, diffuse, disobedient, impatient with the world as it is. And at its center, whether we like it or not, is Palestine. If the Greater South should be read as an unsettled moral geography, then Palestine has become its compass, the place where the world's fractures are rendered unmistakably clear. Palestine is no longer merely a cause, as some people tried to domesticate it into being. It is a lens through which the contradictions of the international system are revealed, a mirror that shows that what global norms mean when stripped of euphemism and bombast and pomp. As the last major anti-colonial struggle carried into the 21st century, Palestine exposes the unfinished business of decolonization. A people dispossessed, repeatedly governed by legal architecture that denies their nationhood and peoplehood, and abandoned by an order that promised self-determination whilst accommodating occupation. After October 7, the thin legitimacy of that order collapsed. The scale and spectacle of Israel's violence, the bombing of hospitals, the starvation of civilians, the forced displacement of entire cities, made it impossible to pretend that this was a conflict between equal parties. The brutality was too visible, too documented, too public, and it unfolded alongside the paralysis of institutions created to prevent that mass atrocity in the first place, and the moral contortions of states that defended those actions when they would condemn it anywhere else. It exposed the central bargain of contemporary geopolitics, that some lives can be destroyed without consequence, and that others should be spared. As Colombian President Gustavo Petro put it, Gaza is a rehearsal of the future. And this is why South Africa's ICJ case resonated so widely. It did not speak for the Greater South or the Global South. It articulated what millions had already intimately understood, that Palestine is the true measure of whether universalism still has any meaning. If international law claims universality, it must be tested where that impunity is deepest. But Palestine did more than diagnose the present. It gestured towards a different horizon. In encampment marches, solidarity committees, and diaspora networks across the world, Gaza became the site around which a new political grammar was emerging. For a generation raised amid climate catastrophe and authoritarian drift and democratic backsliding, Palestine had revived the universalist language that neoliberalism tried to erase: justice, liberation, dignity, not as abstractions, but as imperatives, as calls to action. This is why the ICJ case is more of an ethical rupture than a diplomatic move. South Africa named what the world had been forced to witness, that the violence in Gaza was not an exception, but the logical expression of an order stratified by race, power, and disposability. By centering Palestine in international law, the ICJ case helped articulate what movements across the Greater South were already demanding: a world in which the most vulnerable do not need to beg for recognition. And yet naming is not enough. Palestine forces us to confront a harder question: whether states, as mentioned before, any state, can build the kind of internationalism the century now requires. Even the most promising diplomatic developments of the last year bear this out. The emergence of the Hague Group, for example, an informal coalition of South Africa, Colombia, Brazil, Namibia, Bangladesh, Bolivia, and others, signals a real shift in global South coordination. For the first time in decades, governments are articulating a shared reading of global crisis and acting together on questions of humanitarian law. But the Hague Group remains delicate. It has moral force, but no mass political infrastructure beneath it. It can open discursive space, but it cannot by itself sustain a new international order. For that, it would need to be rooted in the social forces whose demands it echoes. This is where the idea of world making becomes indispensable. Drawing from the work of Adam Getachew, the anti-colonial world makers of the 20th century attempted to build not only independent states, but alternative global institutions. The New International Economic Order, Bandung, the Pan-Africanist Project, for example, were meant to redistribute power and democratize global sovereignty. Their ambitions were vast, but their projects faltered because they were not sufficiently anchored in movements. They were largely elite-led by big statesmen, big figures of the anti-colonial struggle in the 20th century. They were state-dependent, and they were vulnerable to coups, Cold War pressures, commodity shocks, and global finance. When movements weakened, the world-making architecture collapsed. The lesson of this moment matters now more than ever. If a new world is to be made in the 21st century, its foundation cannot be the state alone. It must be movements. The insurgent, youthful, intersectional movements that have re-emerged across the Greater South. These movements, from feminist networks to climate justice coalitions to anti-austerity uprisings, are coordinated in ways the mid-20th century world makers could never achieve. They articulate demands that exceed the caution of governments, they stitch solidarities across borders, and they revive universalist language, equality, dignity, freedom, justice, that states have largely abandoned. South Africa's ICJ intervention belongs in this landscape, not because it offers a blueprint for world making, but because it briefly aligned state action with the moral energy circulating beneath it. The state spoke for a moment from within the ethical imagination of the Greater South. But that alignment is fragile. Without movements capable of widening and defending the horizon the ICJ moment opened, it will remain episodic, a flash of moral clarity rather than the basis of a new global order. Gaza is a flashpoint that forces us to ask the question that states cannot answer, but which movements must. What kind of world must we build so the future is not simply a repetition of Gaza? If never again did not mean never again, what must it mean? If the ICJ case forced us to look outward at Gaza, at power, at the collapsing architecture of international law, then the final question forces us to look inward, towards the ethical and spiritual labor without which no political project can endure. Liberation is never only geopolitical, it is also moral. It concerns not only what nations do, but what people become. And this inward work is the hardest part. It asks us to examine our comforts, our silences, the ways we distance ourselves from the suffering of others by calling it structural or inevitable, to recognize how easily outrage can become performance, how effortlessly the language of justice detaches itself from the practice of it. World making is therefore not only a diplomatic or legal endeavor, but a spiritual one. The Hague Group matters, South Africa's ICJ case matters, but none of it will endure without an ethic capable of sustaining it. When Lara introduced me, she mentioned that I'm a writer and an editor, and those things mean something, but the most important thing that I am now is that I'm a father. My daughter arrived into the world 6 months ago, into one that feels unbearably fragile. A world of deepening climate crisis, tightening borders, economies organized around despair. In her presence, the distance between Cape Town and Gaza, Mafasha or Goma collapses. The distinction between their children and mine collapses. The abstraction of future generations becomes concrete. Suddenly, world making is not something entrusted to governments or courts, it becomes a personal obligation. To hold her is to feel almost physically the demand that the world must be remade, that cruelty cannot be normalized, that indifference cannot be inherited. And it is here that Palestine enters unexpectedly, but unmistakably into the intimate space of parenthood. Gaza is not only where the old order has been exposed, it is where we are forced to confront who we must become if another one is to be born. It refuses the distancing habits that allows us to imagine the violence elsewhere and has nothing to do with our own moral responsibilities. It insists that solidarity is not merely an act of witness, but an act of becoming more attentive, more courageous, more patient, more defiant of resignation. Liberation in this sense is as much about the cultivation of character as the transformation of structures. And so often, I find myself returning to the closing words at The Hague. Not the legal reasoning, which was cogent, powerful, forceful, compelling, but the moral posture invoked by Bline Nia Garlach carried into the room when she invoked the question posed by Pastor Manta Isaac in Bethlehem as his congregation mourned. Where was I when Gaza was going through a genocide? It is a question that cannot be answered institutionally, it can only be answered personally. It is a mirror held up to each of us, scholars, citizens, parents, demanding not only explanation, but accountability, not only sympathy, transformation. South Africa, she said, has done what it could. The harder question, the one that would outlive this case, is whether we will do what we must. I do not know what the world will look like when my daughter is my age. But I know that that question, where was I, is now tethered to her future. She will stare me into my eyes and ask it of me, and ask it of everyone she meets. And I know that whatever the world she inherits, whatever that world looks like, will depend less on the eloquence of states than on the work that we commit to, the solidarities we build, the courage we cultivate, and the futures we choose not to abandon. The ICJ case is one chapter in that story. The movements rising across the Greater South and across the world are another. All of it begins with us, with what we demand, what we cultivate, what we refuse, and what we are prepared to build in the name of those who cannot yet build for themselves. Thank you.
The moment. We have time for some questions. I will take the honor of sitting next to you to ask the first one and let others gather their thoughts, and please do get ready to share a question to Will in the time that remains. Thank you so much for these thoughtfully gathered comments of both. I'm sort of struck by last night there was a panel in honor of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and one of the authors, whose last name is escaping me now, from Zimbabwe, and who teaches at Reed College, was talking about sort of Ngugi's language and how she tried to work, sort of honor that in her own writing of sort of an intimacy as well as a sort of much bigger vision, and kind of going from the macro. And I felt that in the way that you were also talking about these issues, the really big questions of moral clarity and what you talked about there of sort of cultivation of character, to the really intimate of our own, whether we're parents or not, whether we're teachers or not. I often see this in my students as well, whatever sort of intimate relationships we have, and the question of where was I during this genocide? What was I doing or not doing? That question to each of us. So thank you for posing that to us today, but also really helping us, I think, better think about what the Greater South's relationship is to these questions, which frankly in this city, I think we don't really ever consider, and certainly not from that perspective. So deeply moved and grateful bringing some of those questions to us today. I had some questions prepared, and I'm struck that one of the ones I most wanted to ask is, not surprisingly, where I think you were taking us. I'm sure there are many in the audience who want to drill into the questions around the case in particular, and around even the vignette that you opened with, which is a really important topic that I think we may want to get into. But one of my favorite pieces that you wrote is a piece from I think it's 2019. It looks like I forgot to put the date here. About or it might have been earlier, called "Don't Seed the Streets," which is obviously what you're talking about here. But you were talking about student movements in South Africa, Fees Must Fall, Roads Must Fall, and others. And I'm going to read a short quote. You say, another thing to overcome is the pathological exceptionalism peculiar to South African political consciousness, of thinking our police are particularly cruel, our higher education system particularly inaccessible, our state particularly corrupt. Being able to see how our problems are more or less the same as everywhere else in the world empowers us to draw lessons from those who are fighting them earnestly. And whether it was in Chile in 2019, so it's right after, it's in 2020, I think, or 2021. The US in June last year, referring to the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. Nigeria in October this year, that would be 2021, and the SARS protests. India at the start of this year, or Myanmar right now. One lesson indoors: don't seed the streets. We don't always have to take them, but they are ours for the taking. We are stronger than we think, and that is why they fear us. I think, in that I saw something that I think we in Washington and in the United States can relate to, and yet are really thinking a lot about in 2025, this idea of sort of US exceptionalism or not, and the ways in which we are revisiting lessons from folks in South Africa, folks in Gaza and the occupied territories, about thinking about the state power, fear, fatigue, all the things that come from resistance movements, and how to keep up the energy to not seed the streets. And I certainly heard that in a lot of what you were talking about, and how Palestine really is the center. It is not just a cause, but really a lens, but also a way to sort of think about this cultivation of character. So I wondered again if you could talk more about those lessons from not thinking of any place as exceptional, yeah. Washington, Johannesburg, or Khan Yunis, or elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. That's a great question. And yeah, thank you for referencing that piece. And again, for the opportunity to be here today. Something that Novuyo also said yesterday at the gathering is, she said she was encouraging everyone to read. And the reason she said we should all read is because everyone, and this is a sort of timeless observation, that everyone thinks their own problems are unique and they're the first ones to encounter them until they open up a book. And I think it's a kind of similar sentiment in my case, which is to say that, part of what I think this moment is contributing to is the recovery of true universalism, not universalism as it's been kind of butchered by liberal humanitarianism or the fictions of the rules-based international order, but really an idea of humanity as being constituting a group of people who deserve the same rights, the same freedoms, the same protections, et cetera, and believing that without exception. And so even Palestine, part of the significance of this moment is invoking the language of never again means never again for anyone, right? The memory of the Holocaust and the devastation that caused, and is saying that the brutality that we witness in Palestine is horrifying, but it is not exceptional. Even that is not exceptional, right? We see it in Sudan, we see it in the DRC, and that what requires fundamental transformation are the structures of power that permit the disposability of human life committed by the powerful with such impunity. And that if we can recover planetary consciousness that names the people in power who are doing what they're doing, and that sees how the geography of power is itself tightly connected, and that can name a planetary subject that can resist that, then I think that is how we will begin to, genuinely kind of forge transnational solidarities that are not only kind of rooted in recognition of shared oppression, shared struggles, shared problems, but also that are invested in thinking through what is the alternative, what is an alternative global order that does legitimately recognize the humanity of everyone without exception. And so I think the beginning of arriving there starts from seeing injustice anywhere as the condition of possibility for injustice anywhere, which is it's a tall order. It's easier said than done. Human history is littered with more cases of brutality, divisiveness, dehumanization, and victimization than it is of its opposite. But precisely why that happens, I think, is by not only seeding the streets, but seeding the horizon of possibility of believing that there can be another way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and these are the conversations we so often have here at universities, right? So I think that's why it's so valuable to think about that, right? As folks are thinking about the horizons for themselves. So I'm happy to help facilitate a discussion. I'll gather maybe 3 questions at a time, if that's okay with you, just so that we can try to get as many as possible. So I'll do a hand. Oh, you certainly can. I'll do this question, and then that question, and then we'll gather another group of questions.
First of all, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm hoping that the organizers.
It is taped, and you'll be able to get a recording.
What is your name, sir? Sorry.
Ibrahim Movement.
Ibrahim, nice to meet you.
And I'm a senior citizen. I've been involved in civil rights and social justice since I got arrested at 15 years old in my hometown, Columbus, Georgia, because I couldn't go to the old white library, American apartheid. But I'd like for you to drill down, if you could, on how is it that the United States government says that our biggest enemies were Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, but they expelled Ibrahim Rasool. In fact, I happened to be at his house for iftar the week before he was expelled from the country, and many people don't see the contradiction. If these are our biggest enemies, what is it that caused Trump and the Secretary of State to expel them?
Thank you.
Did you say something about Ibrahim Rasool too?
Yeah.
Yeah, great, excellent. Yes.
Hi, I'm Abhishek Patina. Thank you so much for your lecture. The way in which my imagination is stimulated by what you're saying is to ask what you think the role of including American actions in Iraq, Western actions in Iraq and Syria would help or not help the cause that you're advocating.
You say that again, sorry.
How in the task of holding power accountable in the movement that we're trying to build, what is the role of looking at Iraq and Syria and the role?
Thank you. Yeah.
Asking because of your publication, really, but you describe South Africa as a small country, and I might dispute that from certain standpoints, but I think you know that too. And so then my question to you is, what would it take for South Africa to no longer be a small country?
Okay.
Great. So we'll do those 3 and then we'll gather some more. Yeah.
Okay, so Mr. Ibrahim, thank you for your question. First of all, Ibrahim Rasool was the short-lived South African ambassador to the United States, appointed by Cyril Ramaphosa in the 7th administration, which is the government formed after the 2024 elections. He was expelled from his post after he made some public remarks that were critical of the Washington administration. And to answer your question of, why, despite the US's utterances of their greatest enemies constituting these other states, did they expel Mr. Rasul and take such a, harsh step in ousting him? I think part of it is rooted in what I was saying earlier. And, to put it crudely, it's racism. I think, the problem of the 21st century still remains the problem of color line, as Du Bois said, in the sense that I think what South Africa did in taking Israel to The Hague was challenge a worldview that believes that there are states that are at the top and should dictate global conduct and global affairs, and that there are other states who should fall in line. And I think that, simply put, the idea that a Black majority country in Africa could so much as dare take the state of Israel, which is the only democracy in the Middle East, to The Hague and accuse it of genocide, which is, something that countries in the third world do, not civilized democracies like Israel. In that imagination, I think this was an assault on a self understanding of the United States and its allies, precisely because it came from South Africa, which I think, after the end of apartheid, South Africa's re-entry into global politics happened on it was extended a lot of goodwill, right? It was the country of Mandela, and it had vanquished the forces of apartheid relatively peacefully. At least that was the kind of official narrative. And so it wasn't supposed to be this country that was, trying to rock the boat. It was in, very, very saccharine kind of conception, meant to be this, source of hope and inspiration. And then it fell off the beaten path, right? Over the last kind of 15 years to 2 decades, South Africa has largely been interpreted as a place that has strayed. And it has. I don't want to deny the material realities of the country, the inequality, the unemployment, that have its sources in very abundantly clear structural factors owing from the legacies of colonialism and apartheid. But I think a lot of people in the West saw that as, look, that's South Africa's fast en route to becoming another Zimbabwe, another failed state. And this is the danger of what happens when you give Black people the rights to self-government and self-rule. And so I think that's why that happened. In short. And then Abhishek, I got your name correct? Yeah, to answer your question, I think absolutely we have to account for Western and specifically American complicity in the destruction of Iraq and Syria. We published on Africa as a Country, which everyone should check out, a fantastic essay by a Palestinian Jordanian author recently, which speaks about the importance of expanding our categories of harm at the level of states to not only focus on genocide, which immediately kind of traps us into an image of large-scale killing directly in the barrel of the gun, right? Which is how some people kind of associate it, to also thinking about how a mechanism of genocide includes what she calls sociocide, which is, destroying the conditions that make life possible, both bare life in the sense of the material provisions that you need to live and breathe and move, as well as political, civic, and social life, what societies require for flourishing and self-government. And so understood through that lens, what is happening in Palestine is consistent with what's unfolded in Iraq and Syria, in the sense of not only destruction in terms of people being slaughtered, but also the possibility of any society being completely snuffed. And the flattening of infrastructure, the fragmentation of society, and kinship networks, etc., has made it impossible for people to sustain any meaningful life. And that is not only the case in the Middle East, but in large parts of the continent, in large parts of the world as well. And so understanding how that happens, not only as far as the conduct of states against other states, but also internally within states themselves, I think is critical for our ability to name not only the oppression that is happening, but also to understand how to fight it. And then the final question, I didn't get your name.
Peter.
Peter. So, I mean, I describe South Africa as a small country because I think that's how people in this part of the world might think of South Africa. I don't think it's a small country, but I don't think it's a big country either. I don't know what it means for a country to be small or big. But I think, what was the second part of your question?
I assumed you were referring to it in some sort of, in a different sense.
Right. What I mean is that South Africa is not a superpower, right? And, you know, I think is very influential on the continent, very influential in the region, but is not widely understood as a great power that dictates international affairs. And I think part of why the backlash to the ICJ case was so strong is, I think, the powers, the great powers of the world, particularly the United States and its allies, looked to South Africa and, wanted to know, who are you? Who do you think you are to take a state like Israel to The Hague? And so I was using it in that sense.
Thanks. I've already started to see hands. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, okay. So, we'll do 1 and 2 and 3. 3 of our, 5 of our, yeah.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Emily Khadan. I actually want to kind of build a bit on the second question, maybe take it in a different direction. So I just want to think a bit more with you and maybe invite you to think with me if we accept that, which was what I heard coming out of your presentation, that's, where we are and how we think is shaped where we are, right? So thinking about the South, and the South is a moral geography. And in that, you also, say that we have to move beyond the state and accept the limitations of the state. Of course, you're thinking from South Africa and the contradiction of the South African state, but thinking from North Africa and West Asia, where we've seen the systematic destruction of the state, right? In the South, in this moral geography that you're saying is a shared geography. NATO destroyed Libya more than 10 years ago. Palestine has been destroyed for 80 years. Lebanon is currently under Israeli occupation and US trusteeship. Syria is occupied by Israel, by Turkey, and by the US. Iraq was destroyed. So if we think of these geographies as part of the South, where there is an aspiration to a state, actually, how can we then think about this moral geography and commonality that it's an invitation to, because I don't know the answer, right? But I just know that thinking from these spaces where US imperialist wars of de-development are based on the dismantlement of the state. And whereas all these kind of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial possibilities and solidarities emerged precisely because of the post-World War II state project, not tethered to the state. I'm not saying that the Egyptian regime, revolutionary regime, guided, was not without contradictions. They did lock up all the communists, right? We all know this. But they did allow this kind of opening you're talking about with South Africa. This is what these states meant. But now we're at this, in part of this kind of moral geography of the South that you're portraying, we need to also see that in part of that, there is an aspiration to a state to allow for this movement. The state has been foreclosed, so I just want to think with you, actually. From these different geographies. Seriously.
Great. Thank you so much, Annie.
Hi, I'm Fida Adeni, and I have two questions, if that's okay. One is, you said South African solidarity with Palestine is real, but you also talked about the kind of contradictions or moral inconsistencies and regional weaknesses, and I just wonder, how does that play out in South Africa? Like, in the sense of, how is this perceived by citizens? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of diversity in that, but how do people think about those inconsistencies? Does it become a point of contention as people think about a strong position vis-a-vis Palestine, but weaker position on other issues? And you did mention one example in the DCR, right? And then the other question I had is, as we think about this, the greater South and the imperative to kind of, the movement building imperative kind of getting beyond the state, how do you see the United States and communities in the United States fitting in that?
Yeah,
And one more, can we?
Yeah.
Is that okay? You
Yeah.
got it?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Will, that was an outstanding talk. I'm glad we had
Yeah.
a chance to talk afterwards in my class. But one of the running themes of your lecture was politics doesn't begin and end with the state, you said. We need a return of mass mobilization that challenges a state-centric world. Could you elaborate on that in specific terms and what you mean?
Yeah.
Can
Okay.
I add one more from
Yeah.
I'm gonna add one more, from the online audience, which is an important part of our audience, and then we'll see if we can do another round or not.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that there are folks with us virtually as well. What do you think of why only 2 other African countries are in the Hague group? Thinking of how South Africa can't lead if others don't want to follow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, you guys are expecting a lot from me.
Yeah. And you haven't disappointed
but-
thus far.
But I mean, I think, Anahid, I think your invitation is the right one, which is, we're here to think together. And I will try and combine your question now there with my response to Anahid. What I was trying to name in my remarks earlier is I absolutely think that the imperative to think from where you are is absolutely crucial, and to begin by describing the reality that is around you, and that the nation state form remains the paradigmatic way through which political and social experience is structured for most people. The state still exists as the entity through which economic and social goods are distributed, through which people make rights claims, through which power is contested. But I think what I've been wondering about is I think the fact of the nation state form being exhausted by political reality. And the fact of the matter is that I think not just in places where it has been deliberately destroyed and decimated by external actors, but even in places where it hasn't, where, the state it's falling apart, it's disintegrating. In South Africa, where I am from, that is kind of plain to see in the ways in which the specificities of South African neoliberal capitalism has created an incredibly weak, hollowed out state that is incapable of providing basic services to ordinary people, and that has paved the way for, organized crime interests to be, in the lives of many South Africans, their main point of reference for accessing, basic social goods, whether it's, housing or protection, where the South African government doesn't have a monopoly of violence in large parts of the territory. So, I'm not a political scientist, so it's been a while since I've studied politics in undergrad. But thinking about the categories that the criteria for what constitutes a state, I think in many places that doesn't exist for a lot of people, and I think it's because the way global power has been reconfigured through neoliberalism, through globalization, is that it's made, I think, in practice, the nation state form outmoded, but we're caught in this weird interregnum where, the old is dying, but the news struggling to be born, to use the kind of overdone Gramscian axiom. And I think that in many places, at least places that I watch closely on the continent, I think that the state is invoked as a shorthand for an alternative that we cannot yet really name. And I think that the way we arrive at a concrete imagining of what that alternative is through struggle, is in the process of building these transnational solidarities that are rooted in shared experience. Because I think it's in the process of doing that we will not think up alternatives to the nation state form in abstraction as, cookbooks for the workshops of the future, that we are going to say, as was the case in the 20th century, that, the state wins independence in the first stage of the revolution, and attains bourgeois democracy, and then there's a socialist revolution second, right? I think that kind of theory of change and transformation has been defeated by history. But I think it's in struggle that we will develop something better, which is why I think the struggles are important. And I think you're certainly seeing it on the continent that, there's been this wave of Gen Z mobilizations that have been gripping the continent. I was in Nairobi earlier this year where there were commemorative protests to mark a year since the End Finance Bill and Ruto Must Go struggles. And, people are making claims upon the state. They're leveling their demands on the state. But I think a lot of people are disillusioned with it. They're disillusioned with liberal democracy, representative democracy. If you look at the Sahel, where there's been the so-called junta wave, people are saying, democracy doesn't work for us. They're not necessarily the most enthusiastic about having strong men in power, but for a lot of people, that's the best that the moment can produce for them. And what I'm saying is that if you look at the way people are interpreting power and alternatives to power at the present moment, doesn't seem to me like it's the language of Bandung or the New International Economic Order. It's not the language of the 20th century, where, the state was seen as being the first condition of, fighting for something better. And people wanted to win independence for that reason. It feels like something different. And part of that is that I think that, human experience itself has been so thoroughly transformed as a consequence of globalization, and the fact that, people are citizens of the world in as much as they're citizens of the countries where they're in, that the commonalities between a kid in Nairobi and a kid in Antananarivo are, unbelievable. Everyone's on TikTok, everyone's on X, everyone is consuming and manufacturing memes in the same way, that there are the ingredients of planetary experience, where people sort of come at reality with the same shared references, just given how communication has been thoroughly transformed. And that, the way the printing press transformed politics in the 20th century, I think the internet has really transformed politics in the 21st, and the political possibilities of that as well. And we haven't yet seen that translate to political struggle just as yet, at least transnational political struggle. So I hope that kind of we can have the conversation, continue to have the conversation. But what I'm saying in summary, not to keep kind of keep going on, is to say that I do think the state is important, but I think the state is an imperfect way of naming a desire for something more thoroughgoing. And I don't think we've yet had the language to capture what that is exactly, but I don't think we can arrive at that language beforehand. I think it will only be formed in the struggles to come in the future. And then
Sorry.
yes, yeah, I forgot. Theda, you had two questions. Please remind me of them.
Yeah, so one was about, you talked about this tension between solidarity with Palestine,
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
more consistency on other issues, and I was asking how that played out
Yeah.
in South Africa, and then the other was kind of the role of communities in terms of thinking about mobilizing and the Greater South, thinking about
Right.
places in the US as
Yes.
part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the first one, there was a backlash, domestic backlash, and it was, largely from kind of like white cultural and commercial elites who were worried that if we fell afoul of Washington, that this was going to be bad for the economy primarily. But that was, it was outsized in terms of the platforms they had to express that. But it was marginal in terms of, where public consciousness was at. I think a lot of South Africans have a very organic affinity and solidarity with the Palestinian cause. It doesn't mean that every South African is on the streets when there are mobilizations for Palestine, because a lot of South Africans are locked in a brutal daily struggle for survival. And so there's also political demobilization that has affected the extent of Palestinian solidarity, but it's otherwise generally embraced and supported, and a lot of South Africans cheered on the actions of the ANC. That said, though, it wasn't enough for the ANC to be spared from their vast record of domestic sins, and their performance in last year's elections is a reflection of that. The fact that they lost their political majority for the first time and then entered into this unholy coalition with a sort of traditionally white opposition party, and the fact that they continue to hemorrhage support and continue to lose sort of good standing in the eyes of the public, which has created a very kind of interesting sort of political scenario where, in fact, Tembega and Lukai Toby put this while he was one of the lawyers, the ICJ case, in an interview with the FT, where he said that South Africa is kind of at an interesting crossroads where, on the one hand, the ANC's record at home has been disastrous, but on the other hand, it does remain the only political party that does embrace these humanist, universalist values. It's sort of non-racialist, it's non-tribalist, it's non-sexist. It still has a kind of egalitarian DNA, even if that is not really translated into practice and largely exists on paper. And the other political alternatives on offer, don't have that. So there's this big worry about, and, it was a dilemma for a lot of people that, I knew, where some people were like, don't like the ANC, but might consider voting for them just because it's important to have a political party which on the international stage can still defend noble and just causes. Whereas many of the other options on the table are either centrist and won't do that, or are populist and in fact are sort of in alignment with kind of identitarian and particularist causes, whether on the basis of national identity, there's a lot of xenophobia in South Africa, or on the basis of racialized identity, or whatever the case might be. So domestically, South Africa is facing exactly the same questions that a lot of other countries are facing as well. And then the other part of the question about it was about
US mobilization.
sorry,
US mobilization.
US mobilization. Sorry if you don't mind repeating the second part.
Just thinking about this global system and the Greater South.
The Greater South, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Part of what I like about the Greater South as conceptual terrain is that I think it can much more easily accommodate the notion that there are cores and peripheries in every place. And I think that is the case in the United States. I don't think that the United States is just a univocal metropolitan center that does bad things to other countries, Those big white buildings over there do that, but I think there are core periphery dynamics in every place. And I think that the Greater South can accommodate, the geography of it is misleading. I actually prefer third world as a term that could be recovered. I don't think it can, because I recognize that the political conditions that made that term legible are gone. But I think as far as thinking through terminologies that can capture the political consciousnesses that are developing in the moment, I think the Greater South is much more accommodating of this field of contention that is not decided primarily by geography, but is decided by, class and racial and national dynamics altogether.
Mm, mm. The Hague Group, I think, was the last, the one from online,
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Remind me of what it was.
Why,
If
why
there's
only
only-
South African countries?
yeah.
Why only two South
Yeah,
African
and then we'll
countries?
be, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, there's, I think because of the constraints that a lot of African countries face, who aren't as, there's a lot to say, but I think the main thing to say is that other countries don't want to fall afoul of, the United States and global powers who determine investment flows and the economic possibilities of their countries. And in fact, a lot of African countries have economic and trade relationships with Israel that I think their political elites determine are beneficial for them and their populations. South Africa and Namibia are kind of the anomalies in the sense that they've got this political history that I spoke about earlier. But even then, as I was saying earlier, that doesn't sort of preclude the fact that we still have trade relationships with the state of Israel, that we haven't pursued fully throated BDS yet, that we're still kind of walking a very fine line of how to sort of express the solidarity forcefully, but at the same time preserve what is viewed as national and economic interest.
Wow, you've given us a lot to think about, including several things that I think don't often come up in these, complex and global conversations as well as local. So thank you so much, Will.
Thank you for having me.
that. And thank you all for coming and staying to the end and finding a spot in this room. I think it shows the interest and importance of this topic. And thank you to folks like Jonathan and others here who helped make it all happen, Mafaz and all of our colleagues. So
Thank you very much.
thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.